It was a fascinating race in Mexico, with the red flag in the middle setting up an interesting sprint strategy at the end. But it was Verstappen who took his 16th race win of the year as he cruised to the checkered flag once again. But it was behind Verstappen where things got interesting, and there's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Mexican Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Verstappen's exceptional race pace unlocks a whole new strategy. Even starting from third on the grid, it was quite clear that Verstappen would be the fastest runner at the Mexican Grand Prix. Typically, the driver that gets pole in Mexico rarely takes the win, as the run into the first corner is incredibly long and can leave the driver without the slipstream vulnerable to the other drivers behind. Verstappen took the lead into turn 1, getting ahead of Sainz with a great launch, and then driving down the inside of Charles Leclerc as he was quick to seize the advantage into that first corner. From there, Verstappen would have to run his own strategy. He was far quicker than the Ferraris behind him and stopped far earlier than all those drivers behind him as well. From there, it was clear that he could do a 2-stop strategy with no real concern of losing out to the drivers behind on a 1-stop. Without the safety car and subsequent red flag, I'm sure Verstappen would have stopped again and still won this race comfortably with his new set of hard compound tyres. Instead, Verstappen had to defend from the front once again. He was audibly frustrated with the red flag, which I believe is expected and reasonable whenever a Tech Pro barrier gets hit with that much force. But even with the restart on hard compound tyres, Verstappen wasn't phased, and we didn't really see him throughout the final stint as he built a 14-second lead over Lewis Hamilton and comfortably took the win in Mexico once again. It was a brilliant Grand Prix for Max, and he was once again in a class of his own, which we're growing used to in 2023. It's clearly another green box for Max as he delivered so comfortably once again. Ferrari came out of nowhere. Last year, the Ferrari team really struggled in the altitude of Mexico City, as they had to run extra cooling and ended up way down the order compared to their expected running positions throughout the 2022 season. This weekend, it seemed like the team was well down the order once again. Their FP3 runs were hampered by traffic, which meant it wasn't clear where they'd be in the pecking order. In Q2, the Ferrari drivers would only end up 6th and 9th, and were looking like they would at least be behind the Red Bulls, the Mercedes, and the McLaren of Oscar Piastri. But in Q3, their cars suddenly came alive. The higher temperatures compared to earlier in the day put the Ferrari in their operating window, and suddenly they had a pace to lock out the front row with their first quick laps. This was a surprise even for the Ferrari team. It seemed like they didn't really know where they stood in the pecking order before the session, but managed to find a way to come out on top for the second race in a row and for the 6th time in 2023. It was an impressive performance from Ferrari, and coming into the race the team did well to only lose a position initially to Max Verstappen. Despite damage to his front wing, Charles Leclerc seemed to have exceptional pace on Sunday in the Grand Prix. The Ferrari must have lost significant downforce, but he was comfortable to extend his first stint and had no intention of getting a new front wing before the red flag. It was impressive to see the Ferraris holding their own and seemingly being able to hold on for a good race pace in Mexico compared to last year and compared to other races this season. For me, the Ferraris did a good job today. Leclerc lost a position to Hamilton at the restart, but in the hands of Hamilton that Mercedes was probably the faster car this afternoon. So it's a green box for Ferrari for a surprising weekend where they suddenly found some pace in Q3. Before we look at Ricciardo's best result of 2023, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to Behind the Drive. I'm trying to reach 60,000 subscribers before the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi, so if you haven't already, please subscribe today. Daniel Ricciardo is back. The star of the Mexican Grand Prix qualifying was undoubtedly Daniel Ricciardo. The Australian driver had a lacklustre return to the grid earlier this year with some relatively unconvincing performances. He's not been as dominant of his teammate as many as expected him to be on his return to AlphaTauri, but in Mexico he seemed to get back to his best in qualifying. The pack was incredibly close at the front, and despite being in an AlphaTauri, one of the worst cars on the grid, Ricciardo went on to qualify 4th for the Grand Prix. This was an excellent performance. The Australian driver was just over a tenth of a second behind Max Verstappen, which given the car difference is incredibly impressive. Not only this, but Ricciardo managed to outqualify Sergio Perez, who ended up just 0.05 of a second behind the AlphaTauri driver. This was a real shame for Sergio Perez. The driver at his home race actually had a very good qualifying compared to where he'd been throughout the year so far. Perez was less than 2 tenths behind Verstappen, which is exactly what the team need from him consistently, but the fact was that Ricciardo outqualified him in his AlphaTauri, which is a huge result that continues the question surrounding Perez's future in the Red Bull team. Ricciardo's pace was pretty good on Sunday as well. He managed to avoid the trouble into the first corner and was then able to match the pace of the leaders through the opening stint. The drivers were managing the pace to conserve the tyre life throughout the first few laps, but Ricciardo did well to control his pace as well and get good traction out the final corner each time to keep the quicker Mercedes of George Russell behind for several laps. From there, he managed his opening stint well and even kept Piastri behind as Ricciardo was running in 5th. This performance was like Ricciardo before he joined McLaren, and exactly the type of performance that we have been waiting for from the Australian race winner. Following the red flag, Ricciardo was one of the drivers that went for the hard compound tyre with a view to get towards the end of the race on that compound and not risk the quicker, but perhaps less durable medium compound. Of course, we can't expect the AlphaTauri to be ahead of these faster teams up the order, but Ricciardo continued to hold his own as he built a comfortable gap to Oscar Piastri once again, and despite losing a position to Norris towards the end, he had an excellent Grand Prix, and probably got the most out of what his AlphaTauri car could offer after a brilliant qualifying performance. Ricciardo did almost overtake George Russell at the end, and was clearly the faster car, which is another impressive feat in itself. Ricciardo's result is certainly going to be a memorable one, and will certainly be a factor in whatever his future looks like in this sport. But for me, I think he needs to continue to show these types of performances in the final 3 rounds to keep putting the pressure on Sergio Perez. It was Ricciardo's first 6 points of 2023, and AlphaTauri's best result of the season so far, so for me, it was definitely deserving of a green box for Ricciardo. AlphaTauri took themselves from 10th in the standings to 8th with that result, which was highly impressive and clearly shows that the upgrades that the team brought to Singapore have worked well for the car. Sergio Perez goes for a move that was never going to work. The home hero was the first retirement from the Mexican Grand Prix this year. As I mentioned earlier, the driver actually had a pretty good qualifying performance relative to Verstappen and compared to other performances this season. He wasn't too far behind his world champion teammate, and he was clearly fired up for this home race weekend. Off the line, Perez got a great launch from 5th. He gained a slipstream from his teammate and was then ahead of Ricciardo and Sainz heading towards the first corner. This was an opportunistic move, but he took the space on the outside of turn 1, which seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But what followed, for me, was probably Perez's fault. The Red Bull driver turned in early, seemingly assuming that Leclerc either had the space on the inside or that the Ferrari driver would have braked early. This was clearly not going to work. He seemed to turn without considering the fact that Verstappen was on the inside, and in the end the Mexican driver got thrown up into the air and off the track into turn 1 and subsequently out of the race. For me, it was a racing incident into turn 1, but with Perez probably slightly more at fault for what was a very bold move. Perez's interview with Sky following his retirement was quite telling. He obviously seemed to be very disappointed with his outcome, and he seemed to stand by his decision to go for it into turn 1 with the view that it would be his best opportunity to go for the race win at his home Grand Prix. While I appreciate his passion and desire to win his home Grand Prix, it felt like he'd lost sight of the bigger picture. Perez is reportedly fighting for his seat, and even taking his first podium finish since Italy would be a fantastic result for the second Red Bull driver. But instead, we saw a move that we wouldn't expect from a driver of his experience level, and perhaps even similar to those that we saw in Singapore and Japan earlier this year from Perez. It was good to see on the live feed that there was support from Christian Horner for Perez later in the race. It was clear that the Mexican driver was doing well this weekend, and hopefully he's shown that he deserves to keep his seat going into next year. For me though, it's got to be an amber box for Perez. He had a good qualifying, which certainly implies that he found something this weekend, but his race performance, all one corner of it, was poor, and for me he wasn't thinking about the bigger picture and the implications of his bold move on Leclerc. Norris charges back through the field. Lando Norris had a disappointing qualifying in Mexico. He had a fuel system issue with his car, which meant he couldn't get out early into Q1, and he then made a mistake on his first flying lap as well. His second attempt was hindered by the yellow flag for Alonso's spin, and subsequently Norris was just 17th on the grid. The McLaren has been excellent this season, and Norris has scored 4 podiums in a row coming into this race. But despite coming from the back of the order, Norris was on another level this weekend, making so many moves to carve his way up the field. The British driver went for a differential strategy, initially starting on the soft compound tyre and then stopping early for the hard compound next. From there he worked his way up the order well and was actually competing for strong points before the red flag. A disappointing restart left Norris with a lot of work to do, but he went out and delivered that straight away. He used his medium tyres well and found his way through the backmarker teams with ease. He quickly caught up with his teammate, who was on the same tyre compound, and Norris was about half a second quicker than his teammate. This kind of race pace differential between teammates is so rare to see in the sport, but Norris was just on another level today. Despite his aging tyres in the last 10 laps, Norris managed to make a brilliant overtake on Ricciardo around the outside of turn 4, which is not a place where we've expected to see moves around this circuit. From there, Norris was hunting Russell down, and once he managed to catch up with Russell, he took advantage of a mistake from the Mercedes driver through turn 6, another corner where we don't typically see many overtakes made. If it wasn't for the disappointing start from Norris after the red flag, he could well have pushed for a podium finish today, and I think that restart is probably the only thing stopping Norris from securing a purple box for this performance this afternoon. For me, it's a green box for Lando, as he delivered an amazing comeback from 17th on the grid to finish 5th. It was a joy to watch as he continued to hold the pace despite his tyres surely starting to drop off after a long stint. Honourable Mentions. A couple of honourable mentions today, and the first has to be for Lewis Hamilton. The Mercedes driver did an excellent job to take second position, including a great final stint where he took the position away from Charles Leclerc at the start of it and had enough tyre left at the end for the fastest lap as well. It was a tremendous drive and he's still trying his best to get second in this Drivers' Championship. Alex Albon also deserves an honourable mention. Williams looked incredible in free practice and he was even second in FP3. Their car looked like a rocket ship in Mexico, but in the hotter conditions he dropped back and couldn't maintain that pace. But despite this, Albon drove well on the counter strategy to take 9th at the finish, securing another 2 points for his Williams team.